Okay, so we have to click that, got it. So, because it is being, this webinar is being taped and will be available to your friends at some other point on the Mass Peace Action YouTube page. Okay, everyone has been nice enough to get here on time, so maybe we should start. Well, we're certainly at a time when we live in a time of multiple crises, some of which we've really never seen before to this level, never mind happening all at the same time. And we're experiencing these crises at a time of incredible polarization among different groups in the country, and that's going on in a lot of countries, but certainly in the United States right now. So not only are we hit with this tsunami of crises, but they are taking place in a time when different parts of the population are not talking to each other or hate each other. Very dangerous time, but everyone on the call knows that already. Tonight, we're hoping to deal with this confluence of crises and the threats that they bring to our possible extinction as a human race, and try to find a way through this and kind of look for signs of hope and ideas that will bring hope. What happened is that the Massachusetts Peace Action, Peace and Climate Group decided to have this discussion with Charlie and Suren. I'm going to be introducing them formally in a minute, but we started to talk about some of the topics we're going to talk about tonight, the interrelationship of issues and the complex time we're in and a way through it. And we had such an interesting discussion that we decided, hey, let's go and share this discussion with as many people that might be interested in it. So that's how we ended up having this webinar tonight. The title of the webinar, as you know, is the title of the book that Charlie and Suren are in the process of finishing up and will be published within the next couple of months. The name of that book is Dying for Capitalism: How Big Money Fuels the Threat of Extinction. And tonight's the webinar is brought to you tonight. We have three sponsors. The first is the Massachusetts Peace Action, Peace and Climate Working Group. And I've put that link in the chat, but basically this is a group in Massachusetts Peace Action that tries to bring together the climate movement with the movement against militarism and for peace, with the belief that neither movement, the climate movement or the peace movement, can succeed without the other because of the way that these issues of climate and peace are interrelated. We hope you'll take a look at our webpage on the Mass Peace Action website, and that you will consider joining us at our next meeting. We need all the help we can get. We do have some good relationships with climate people now, and we hope to develop those as time goes on, given the need to do that. And the other sponsors of tonight's event are Encuentro 5. Any of you are familiar with Encuentro 5? It's a movement center in the Boston area. It's served peace, pro-immigrant, and the workers' movement as a movement building space in downtown Boston. With the onset of COVID, it's relocated now from next to Park Street over to Community Church of Boston. It has sponsored numerous various activities, including virtual events on several book projects, and also the Shelter in Solidarity series, which is our third sponsor for tonight. Shelter in Solidarity is an online series that has hosted more than 70 conversations that speak to the issues confronting our movements. Most recently, just yesterday, Avi Chomsky hosted a conversation on the Ukraine war, which hopefully will be available for people to watch who missed it. So with that said, I think we should move into this. Our presenters this evening are good friends of ours who have put in their time over the years and have participated in many movements, but have also tried to think deeply and write so that they can share their ideas about our movements and the situation we face and some directions that we might be able to take. So Charlie Derber is professor of sociology at Boston College. He's the author of 25 books. Charlie is trying to catch up with Noam Chomsky in the number of books he's putting out. Among those books are The Wilding of America, The Pursuit of Attention, Sociopathic Society, Corporation Nation. That was what was that, about 15, 20 years ago now? That was a big one. And People Before Profit, as well as the book Welcome to the Revolution. That's a book, one of the newer books of Charlie's that's been translated into 12 languages. All kinds of strategic thinking going on there in that book. That's highly recommended. Welcome to the Revolution. Charlie is a public sociologist and a lifelong activist who writes about structural and cultural analyses of capitalism and social movements seeking transformational systemic change. Suren Moodliar helped found Encuentro 5, a movement building center in Boston that I mentioned earlier, and whose Facebook page is, the link to it is in the chat. He is a managing editor of Socialism and Democracy, and he is co-author of A People's Guide to Greater Boston, which was published in 2020. So this is good if you have people coming into Boston, especially tourists who want to look at the city. This book will help them see with new eyes what's really the history of Boston and these locations that they've been looking at. So that's something to keep in mind, A People's Guide to Greater Boston. And along with Charlie and myself and Noam Chomsky, wrote the book Chomsky for Activists, which was published last year. Suren is also editor and contributor for Turnout, Mobilizing Voters in an Emergency, put out before the 2020 election. And that book pretty much won the election for Biden. Suren has participated in public health, peace, solidarity, and pro-immigrant movements and labor organization. He is currently the secretary of Syracuse DSA. He lives in Syracuse part of the year. To learn more about his work, see his website, to which there's a link also in the chat somewhere. Okay, well, let's begin this conversation. What is going on here, Charlie and Suren? Let us hear your ideas about dealing with these various threats to extinction.
Okay, so thank you very much, Paul. Paul comes to a class I teach on peace or war at BC and is one of the hits every semester. So I'm grateful to Paul for many things, including arranging this event. So I think professors are used to teaching for 50 minutes at a shot or an hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to take about 10 to 15 minutes if I can keep my mouth shut on, with that discipline. And I'm going to sort of just give a kind of overall framework that sort of guides the analysis in this book that we're doing called Dying for Capitalism, which is, it's a little bit strange to be talking about a book that's, it is virtually done, but it won't be actually published until the fall, probably November, October, something like that. So I'm going to talk about just very briefly about the sort of overall framework for our thinking about extinction, how to think about the unthinkable. Extinction has always been described since the nuclear bomb was invented as the unthinkable subject, and we have to make it thinkable. And I want to focus a little bit on how two current events, one is the war in Ukraine, and the other is the rise of Trumpism, is likely to shape the analysis that we're describing in the book, The Prospects for It. And then I'll turn it over to Suren. I'll be giving the bad news, sort of like what the problems are. And Suren is always wonderful because he's got solutions to everything, including the big questions. So if you start getting really depressed as I'm talking, just keep breathing, deep breathing, and then Suren will come along and make you feel better. So yeah, so what we've done in this book is basically sort of try to make the unthinkable thinkable, which is hard to do. When you're talking about extinction, it's a subject that's so overwhelming that you know, the psychologist Ernest Becker many, many years ago, a book called The Denial of Death. That was about the denial of individual death. When you talk about the death of life on the planet, if it's so hard for us to face our own individual mortality, one can only imagine how the mind pushes back against trying to come to terms with collective death and collective extinction. And on top of those psychological pressures are simply all of the institutional forces that are working very hard to keep people from thinking about this too much. Because I think when you do think about it, you think about problems and structures and, you know, political and economic issues that people who run things don't like people to think about too much. So to give you an overview, maybe Suren, you can put up the first chart. We're going to just briefly show a couple of charts that just summarize. Yeah, so I hope you guys can see a chart which is sort of simple. It has capitalism on top and environmental destruction, and then militarism. The arrows are causal flows. So it's showing you that we're arguing that extinction is really a kind of triangle of environmental destruction and militaristic destruction, which is fueled primarily, not only, but primarily by the dominant global economic system, which is global capitalism. So that's just a very simple framing. And Suren, do you want to go to the second? So this is a little bit more of a mind-boggling chart, but I hope people can see it. We'll leave it up there just a little bit longer. I mean, it shows that environmental destruction includes a lot of different kinds of extinction events, like, of course, climate change, but also biodiversity, catastrophe, and the other things under environmental destruction. Pandemics, there's a lot in the book about COVID. And then under militarism, again, in addition to nuclear war, there's cyber war, biological and chemical war, a range of things. And in talking about capitalism, there are a whole set of dimensions of capitalism which give rise to these terrible outcomes. The darker parts of the lines are the more strong causal forces, but they go both ways. So capitalism, as many of you know, is a driver of militarism, but militarism also drives capitalism. After militarism, there's a kind of disaster capitalism that both climate change drives capitalism as well as capitalism driving climate change. So this is a complex chart. And within this, when you see on top broader social structure, class, race, gender, all this triangle of extinction is all embedded within the broader societal system where issues of race and gender and so forth play a very central role. So it takes a book to kind of deconstruct this chart and make sense of it. But I guess if I just wanted to highlight a few things for you to think about, one is just the centrality of capitalism in this chart. And the reason I'm mentioning this is that in the various kinds of analysis that we have of extinction, whether it's of climate or of nuclear issues or the others in this chart, in the United States in particular, you just don't feel people think about capitalism as relevant to this conversation, or if it is, it tends to be the opposite. It tends to be the argument that people like Thomas Friedman, for example, who writes a lot about climate change, argues that capitalism and the technological innovation that it fosters actually is the solution to climate change rather than the problem, the cause of it. Or if it is both, it's the solution is more significant than the problems that are causing. And so the first thing I would just say is that what makes our analysis somewhat distinctive is that we go into substantial analytical detail. I mean, it's very readable book, and it's not for a technical audience. From very much people in this room would all find it an easy book to read, but it's an effort to lay out in particular these causal links and chains that are shown in this chart, and in particular to go through the various elements of capitalism, whether it's the concentration of huge amounts of capital, particularly in fossil fuels and in the military-industrial complex, the constant expansion for more production that leads to militarism, the hatred, the sort of rhetorical hatred of big government and public goods that can arise from public expenditures that are sort of all part of the DNA of most capitalist systems. So much of the book, and I don't want to go into that now, but is an attempt to explore the ways in which the DNA of capitalism, and particularly neoliberal global capitalism, is driving these unthinkable kinds of threats that we're up against right now. So that's one thing I would mention, is just the centrality of capitalism as a kind of root cause, not the only root cause, but a really important root cause. And we take on in the book the arguments that are made by people like Bill Gates and Tom Friedman and others who argue that capitalism is actually the solution rather than the problem, again, primarily because they think of it as a technological problem rather than a systemic political or economic problem. A second element of this chart that I hope probably stands out is just that we're looking at extinction as a very intersectional, intertwined, entangled set of issues. So, and we think the causal directions, like I say, run in all these different ways that the arrows are pointing. So the other thing, I think many people, for example, in climate movements, really don't think very much about militarism or about capitalism, and vice versa, the same for all of these. There's been a tendency in the book that Paul mentioned, Welcome to the Revolution, where I make my sort of analysis of the left, is that we have a left that is very siloed. People pick particular issues, and movements tend to be focused on whether it's identity politics or on just very specific issues. And you can see from this chart that the analysis in this book is that if we want to come to terms with the unthinkable, we have to start thinking in a much different way that's become sort of routinized in progressive and left circles in the United States and in much of the world. And that requires really looking at the intertwining and very strong interconnections. I mean, if you look at this, what it's saying is, if you really care about climate change, you're going to have to change. There's just no way of doing that without changing the organization of our dominant economic system. And the same with, if you care about war, it's not just a matter of changing weapons or whatever. It's a matter of looking at the overall structure of our economic and our political economy, because what the book is trying to show is that the underlying sort of structure of our political economy leads inexorably, relentlessly to these things. These are not things that can be taken on their own and sort of simply dismantled through technical, like simply reducing certain weapons or even just simply reducing certain fuel and so forth, certain kinds of energy. It's a much more globally diverse kind of problem. So, and then just the third thing I'll say, and it's kind of obvious, so it's not on this chart, is that while this is about global capitalism, the book is sort of divided into the global system and then a focus on the US, because of all countries in the world, US capitalism, because it is hegemonic capitalism, it's highly militarized far more than any other country. It's highly fossilized more than any other country. And because the kind of neoliberal economic system that drives extinction in its extreme form is most embodied in the United States compared to other countries, certainly than other Western European countries, even though they have many of the same problems. So a third thing, so I would just highlight for you, one, the centrality of capitalism in this analysis. Second, the structural intersectionality and intertwining of these problems, the need to get beyond thinking about these problems in isolation from each other. And that means getting movements to think in beyond simply focusing on the specific movement that they're targeting. And third, to recognize, I mean, this unthinkable issue of extinction is very much driven by our own country. And so we have a particular, I mean, there's one, a very large part of the book is about the United States and why the United States is so central, both to fueling the problem and to, changes in the United States to trying to find some solution. Okay, Suren, maybe you can, I don't think we need to look at this chart anymore. So in the rest of the time I have, what do I have left? About 5 minutes. I want to just briefly say what I think about two current things that affect the triangle of extinction that we're looking at in a very severe way. One is just talking briefly, I mean, this is going to come up more in the Q&A, is the current war in Ukraine. It's suddenly made, that it's interesting that the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the fourth day of the invasion wrote a letter to, I guess, to Putin and to Biden saying, this is the beginning of what happened to us. And there have been a series of, over the last few weeks of, people, nuclear experts saying the risk of nuclear war coming out of this current event is roughly comparable in their view to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the general view was there was a 1 in 3 chance of a global nuclear war. And about 70% now of the American population say they worry about the possibility of a nuclear war. So in a way, this is, in one sense, a positive thing, in the sense it's awakening people to something that people had sort of forgotten about. That with the end of the Cold War in the Soviet Union, a lot of people, they thought we don't have to think about the danger of global nuclear war. And suddenly people realize that's far from the case. Just very quickly, it is frightening to me to think about all the very imminent, very realistic, without being apocalyptic, or maybe it is apocalyptic, but it's not being catastrophic, I think, more than the truth. There's so many ways that this could escalate into a nuclear conflict. Much of it is being talked about, but just, a few things that can be mentioned is that the US and NATO supplying weapons, in large numbers, both defensive and offensive weapons, although it's not doing it directly through American, forces, but through intermediaries, is being perceived by Russia as engagement that, legitimates escalation by Russia. You probably know already that both Russia and the United States, among all the countries of the world, have nuclear doctrines. The United States has never signed onto a no first strike doctrine. So part of US military strategy is that it's legitimate. In the US, as Dan Ellsberg has written in his book, The Doomsday Machine, which is about American nuclear structure, it's really not about deterrence. It's simply about the US being able to use its nuclear force to get what it wants in the world. This is American power in the world. Russia doesn't see a clear line in its nuclear policy between conventional and nuclear war. It sees use of nuclear weapons as part of a kind of integrated military strategy, which is more likely to be called into play as the conventional strategy of Russia has been, surprisingly weak in Ukraine. So we're seeing the use of, these hypersonic missiles that are capable of planes that are carrying both nuclear and conventional weapons. There's been already talk that the Russians have talked about using in the North Sea and a strike with a tactical nuclear weapon. Both sides have been developing very small tactical nuclear weapons, a lot on the border with Russia by the West, which is scary because there could be a lot of spillover. I mean, we're just this Polish, the Russians just hit a depot that was about 20 miles from the Polish border. There are also all kinds of possibilities of NATO countries escalating into involvement that could trigger an Article 5 World War III sort of thing. I'm sure most of you have seen enough TV to recognize, although it's interesting that as this gets more and more militarized, the solution seems to be more and more weapons to more and more Ukrainians, and Russians pulling in more weapons of their own. There's not very much talk by the national security people or even the liberals who talk about this, about that this is not perhaps the best way to solve this problem by simply pouring in more and more weapons into Ukraine or into the border countries around Ukraine. But the reality is this is what's happening, and it's just terrifying to me to watch this. It's very easy for me to imagine this escalating into a biological, chemical, or a nuclear strike, a small tactical nuclear strike. The other thing I would just say about Ukraine is that you would think on the climate change thing that the fact that sanctions against Russia are primarily involving trying to avoid European dependence on Russian oil and gas could lead to a massive Western decision for what we haven't done, which is a massive Green New Deal to essentially eliminate dependency on fossil fuels by massive investment, not in these military forces, but in renewable and clean energy. That could be a massive impact, but the United States is going another direction. Biden is fueling up the strategic oil reserve, and the Western countries are looking for new sources of oil and gas rather than sort of pointing toward renewables. So a real opportunity, it could be lost here in terms of how a war could. In our chart, we talk a lot about the interaction between climate change and militarism. And this is really important in what's going on in Ukraine right now. So we could come back to that. The final thing I want to say, and I'll to turn this over to Suren, is that the other current issue that's going on is the move toward, in the United States in particular, but worldwide, toward this far right sort of neo-fascist politics, which is happening, of course, could very well is likely to be the outcome of the October fall election, and many, could open things up in a way that turned 2024 into a Trump or Trumpist kind of election. And so I just want to mention in conclusion here a few things that could have on this whole analysis of extinction. One is, whether it's Trump or Trumpism, these are people who are really heavily related to Southwest capital, which is oil and gas capital, the sort of carbon industrial complex, as well as to the military industrial complex. These are, if we see, an electoral or a rigged electoral win by the far right, the parts of capital that are most invested in getting the profits out of fossil fuel when they can are going to be empowered, as are the military companies that have most to gain. Although all companies are, of course, tied into this. The second thing is that, the far right does not believe in international solutions. It's the far right in the United States and around the world is basically a form of, as Nazism was, a form of hyper-nationalism, usually racialized, and therefore is structurally a profound obstacle to the kind of international solidarity or international cooperation that we obviously need. These problems like global warming or global nuclear war cannot be solved by a particular country. So if we see the resurgence of sort of, as we are, of a kind of nationalist ascendancy from the far right and the middle right, and an erosion of whatever international links that we have. So for example, Trump, while he was there, basically tore up a large number of the arms control agreements. He refused to abide by the Iranian agreement. He tore apart by simply never allowed the word climate change to be used and refused to be part of any global climate agreement. So again, as with Ukraine, if we see the emergence of, as I think is very likely starting in October, a much stronger, even than we see now today, faction of the Republican Party dominated by this way of thinking, this is going to be really, the most profound problem of extinction beyond the magnitude and unthinkability of it is the urgency of the time scale. So, we on the left have thought that the arc of history bends toward justice, but it takes time. And we don't have time. We're in a decisive period. And so I'm going to, having given you my most depressing prospects on all this, I'm going to turn you over now to Suren, who can put a smile on your face a little bit more and try to offer some perspectives on how we deal with the unthinkable. Okay, Suren, it's all to you.
So thank you, Charlie. Thank you also to Paul Shannon and Cole Harrison for organizing this event. I've been introduced in many ways. Never has anyone promised that I would deliver a smile. So I'm going to try hard. And I'm also going to, because we have a few minutes left, run through a slide presentation. So if I sound too much like a motor mouth driven by the slides, please tell me to slow down. I realized too that I have an accent that most people are not accustomed to, and so that might also hurt the presentation in terms of speaking really fast to get through a lot of ideas. Paul and Cole will probably recognize many of the ideas being presented here as things that we've been talking about over the years. Together with Charlie, back in 2007, we began what we called a Majority Agenda project, which aimed at trying to find ways in which we could develop a message that connected with the majority and that in turn connected peace, climate, and issues about capitalism in ways that are very familiar given the triangle of extinction that Charlie has described. So given this triangle of extinction, the question that I think we face is, have we in effect written an obituary for the future, having described capitalism as this great threat, recognizing that we are indeed running out of time? Have we reached a moment where we are saying to you and to everyone who reads this book that unless we eliminate capitalism, unless we can radically reform and alter capitalism, the extinction threat will remain. And so once you make capitalism the problem, haven't you in fact created a situation where things are unwinnable, given that it's going to take so much time, at least that's the way we think of it, to reform, eliminate, otherwise alter capitalism. And what we're going to argue is that history is inspiring and that there are examples where humanity's energies have united to focus on extreme threats and have radically reformed and altered capitalism. Although, of course, we're going to be arguing for the elimination of capitalism. The fulcrum of this structural reform has to be the growing of the public sector as a provider of public goods. So we are going to be arguing for a new abolitionism, one that will allow us to work with what we have and radically reform or alter capitalism. Our argument regarding public goods is to refer to a number of things that already exist that emerged as a result of radical social change movements, be it the National Health Service in the UK, social security itself, the ideas of an Austrian socialist that Franklin Delano Roosevelt bought into, or the very simple ideas that even our mayor in Boston is struggling to implement, such as at the urban scale, things like bike lanes and public parks and so on. And of course, when we look at the response to the COVID pandemic, ultimately, even though we have great grievances about these responses, it was the state that had to extend itself and provide things that it previously had retreated from, including in the case, depending on how you view this, the case of vaccinating the entire public with the use of the National Guard to make these things possible. So what we're arguing for is the provision of public goods in a multi-sectoral way that can address historical grievances. It will involve multiple layers of governance, from the hyper-local, neighborhood committees, community organizations, all the way through global governance, and that it can and must address the extinction threats. So a very old idea, it's in place and available to us, which is a resurrection of a revalorization of public goods. The example that I want to give, though, is the example of the abolitionists, which was a very diverse movement, very fragmented, and yet it encapsulated a multitude of anti-slavery viewpoints and strategies. And it happened to reform the capitalism of its day, a form of capitalism that was heavily dependent on slavery. We can go into the history in discussion. The key point that I'm trying to make about the history of capitalism and the history of slavery is that these were closely intertwined, to the point where all the major things that we see as part of normal capitalism today have their origins in some respects in slavery. Development of the stock market, the various forms of collateralized debt obligations have their origins in slavery. And the fact that we were able to, we collectively, the left, I think, were able to defeat slavery and do so by operating on many different scales and in many jurisdictions. There are plenty of examples to turn to, including the fact that the movement could be extremely local. For example, in the 1840s and 50s, the desegregating of railroads was a crucial part of what the abolitionist movement took on while they were taking on. So, very local focus on railroads, but also focus on the greater system of slavery itself. And they were able to unite at crucial turning points, be it to support John Brown, which ultimately triggers the Civil War and results in changing the system. And it was a change that had global ramifications. After all, the United Kingdom and France were heavily dependent on cotton grown in the South. And so this was the work of, not, as is commonly said, a small group of people, but first and foremost, a very diverse movement consisting of the enslaved themselves and their allies in the working classes and in the middle classes, uniting to bring about social change. I think that a close examination, and our book goes into it, of the abolitionist movement provides a model for us today. Go a little bit forward. What we're arguing for today is that there are many ideas or concepts for us working together. The idea of united fronts and popular fronts have existed. However, what we're arguing for, given the global scale and the range of different levels, is for a virtual front. And I'll say a little bit more about that. There's a need to work together through voluntary and decentralized signaling, and we also need bridge-making institutions. In essence, it's a pessimism that we can create a single front where there's command and control kinds of functions. As a result, signaling and bridge-making is really important. And again, we can go into these points at in the discussion period. I would just say one more thing about this virtual front, which is that is in effect what existed within the abolitionist movement, which was riven between people who were interested in peaceful strategies, nonviolent strategies, anti-statist strategies, along with very political forms of abolitionism, including the Republican Party, or at least the radical Republicans of that era, many of them based in Massachusetts. So the question is, how do we work in a virtual front? And I think that we already have developed ethical systems, relationships of reciprocity, and conduct a number of different kinds of active bridge-making activities. And so acknowledging that all of these things exist, we can work with one, and we can do an inventory of these things to help put together this virtual front. Now, the favorite approach in many movements is to respond to other movements by urging them to stop what they're doing. You know, stop that, come and do what we're doing. That doesn't work, right? One certainty is that people will stick to the strategies they are most interested in. So the politics and ethics of movements in the virtual front is that we have to recognize and accept the existence of other strategies and processes. We can't wish them out of existence. And our job as movement people is to figure out how we can utilize the resources, the insights from the other movements to build and expand our own movements, rather than wasting energy at opposing them and opposing their strategies. All of this requires that we be fully cognizant of the triangle of extinction. And the reason for this, the need to have this model, this very simple model of a triangle of extinction, it helps answer the question, right? Who's in the movement and who's out of the movement? And I think that by using the triangle of extinction, we can help understand how it is that we relate to other groups. Charlie mentioned Bill Gates and his work and his sort of approach to technological solutions. Well, using the triangle of extinction, you know, we can return focus to the actual social relations that need to be addressed in order that we may build and develop a cohesive identity in a decentralized way. I think that, and could argue, should we want to discuss this, that class analysis is the glue to build intersectional movements. So movements that involve people of many different identities across many different geographies, but ones that can be identified and find allyship within each other through class analysis. Now, there are many different frameworks for analysis, and this is where the triangle of extinction really gets interesting. In the run-up to COP26, the United Kingdom, the government of the UK, developed a model called shared socioeconomic pathways that describe alternative plausible strategies for societal development. What's interesting is this was developed for what is a very conservative government. And yet the preferred strategy, the shared socioeconomic pathway number one, is sustainability and taking the green road. And the socioeconomic challenges for adaptation are lower, they argue, because it involves an equitable form of development. Now, that's a very what I would consider a very liberal model. The problem is that I don't think enough of us are aware of the existence, the full inventory of many different ideas available to us to challenge the existing system. And I think that shared socioeconomic pathways is one set of models that we can use to identify who we want to work with, how we collaborate with people, right? There are a number of other models that I want to just call your attention to. The bottom line here is that time is short. We have to depend on existing models, and there's a plethora of them. And to the extent that we in our different movements play a bridge building role, which I suspect all 115 of us on this conference call, we tend to be those bridge builders, but we don't tend to place a lot of investment and energy in educating ourselves about these different models. However, given the threat of extinction as a frame that can unite us across many different movements, we have to actively reach out and find these different models. We don't usually advertise different books when you're trying to promote your own book, but I do want to suggest that there are a number of different approaches that are out there that are worth looking at. I'd point your attention to Kate Raworth's book on donut economics, right? 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. What's really interesting about that book is that it spells out the actual scale of different cooperative movements which range into the trillions of dollars. One of the points that Charlie made in the conversation was that we can identify particular sectors of capital with the far right and others with more liberal economic forms. The interesting thing is that today capital confronts us as really one big whole block in some respects. We can talk about a carbon industrial complex, we can talk about a military industrial complex, but there have emerged, especially in the last 20 to 30 years, a whole group of corporations that in fact straddle them and make their living, or we make their living, because they control so many different sectors of capital. There's an integration between military capital and the largest real estate company in the country, right? So that is why we need to begin to understand the counterforms to capital. And I think Kate Raworth is an interesting example of one. Victor Wallace's Red-Green Revolution is another book worth looking at, particularly because, and this goes back to the point I made about class analysis, it tries to uncover the ways in which we can collaborate with one another using class analysis as the basis. I would want to argue too that there is another set of pre-existing ideas for us to lean on, right? And despite my leaning on the abolitionists, I want to turn to a point that a friend of mine, Mark Soderstrom, who works with Shelton Solidarity, also pointed out, that there's a vast wealth in terms of speculative fiction and science fiction that looks at the future and looks at how it is we can work together. One book that I'd like to point out is The Ministry for the Future, which among other things endorses, various economic and political strategies, ranging from, fairly militant models of direct action through some kinds of technical solutionism, which I'm concerned about, but also a vast reorganizing of agricultural systems, including an endorsement of things like permaculture. I think that the Ministry of the Future provides an example of what a virtual front would look like. Action on many different scales in many different sectors without a single controlling organization, yet it leaves us with the aspiration, the will, the desire for something that could unite us all. If there's any idea that can unite us all, I can imagine it is the anti-extinction idea. It may not unite us on tactics, but it provides us all with a common frame so that while someone is working on permaculture in a semi-arid region in Africa, others can be about greening a city like Boston and thereby contributing at the same time to an anti-extinction movement as a whole. Thanks. So I'll return it to Paul to field questions and comments.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Charlie and Suren. Let's see what our viewers are thinking right now. If you have a question or a comment to make, would ask you obviously to keep it brief so others can speak as well. Use the reaction function down at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand, and we will try to keep track of who is raising their hand. We have one from TS.
Hi, yes. I have a question for Suren. The graph you showed with the different SSPs, are those all different models that you were kind of referring to as examples? And what does SSP stand for again?
So shared socioeconomic pathways, SSP, and they're basically scenario planning techniques. And what's interesting is that they include, the situations where the far right controls policy, right? And if the far right controls it and they believe in climate change, their politics are going to be very exclusionary. You can imagine them creating a fortress around their nation, right? And and these are all very possible responses to the catastrophic climate change and the war threats that we face. And so, the preferred pathway, of course, would be one that places a high priority on socioeconomic equity. If we are to place that priority on socioeconomic equity, however, right, that's a nice liberal way of talking about things, but it doesn't describe the kind of struggles that are necessary and the kind of alliances that are necessary to achieve that particular pathway. And I think that's where our analysis would be different from the liberal analysis of the British Met Office.
Thanks. Dennis Kalthofer?
Hi. So yes, I have a question for Suren. How do we talk to organizations that are, well-meaning, maybe more on the liberal side, but are, want to address climate change, but don't have a Marxist analysis and don't understand these sorts of, the problems of capitalism being, and how do we explain that to people or do we not explain it and just work on our own in some way?
I mean, I think Charlie could also come in on this, but let me just say that, this is the analytic framework we're offering. We're asking for class analysis to be used by people like us. And using class analysis, I think, and an intersectional form of class analysis, we can understand the commonality of interests. I spent my weekend canvassing to keep people in their homes, in an anti-eviction thing. We're trying to pass a good cause eviction ordinance in the city, and that kind of work involves people across the political, well, not across the whole spectrum, but it's basic human rights kinds of work that can appeal to a lot of people. I think having a model of the triangle of extinction in the back of our minds allows us to understand who we can relate to and who would be the enemy. For example, one of the places we're going after right now is a company called Related. They're trying to evict a lot of tenants. Related owns Hudson Yards in New York City, right? It's a massive multi-billion-dollar corporation. And so whilst we're active on these immediate issues of tenants' rights, there is a broader analysis that informs who it is we can work with and who it is we have to oppose. So I think that our analytic models and all stay in our toolbox, but when we're out there in the public, we're finding ways to basically shake hands with people. I think there are many different models of this. We mentioned some in the book. For example, when DSA proposed, and unfortunately that campaign didn't end well, but it learned a lot of lessons. They proposed a Green New Deal for public schools, which was something that the way it was carried out was the DSA activists would be in touch, with Jamal Bowman's office, Jamal Bowman being a congressperson who promoted the Green New Deal for public schools. But it also required conversations with teachers' unions, as well as with the building trades, which have a big interest, not only in petroleum infrastructure, as one of the people pointed out, but also in the various forms of adaptation that have to happen in the schools, which means they have a stake in defining the public sector that we're talking about. And if they have that stake and we work with them to advance it, I think we are building the relations immediately that are necessary for us to move forward, together and challenge the triangle of extinction with something that we're tentatively calling a circle of creation.
Just to add to that question, I really think it's really important that the issue of extinction is not a left issue per se, despite the way we're framing it. It's a human, universal issue. I mean, I think the thrust of your question was, how do we relate to people who are not strictly on the left, who are not anti-capitalist, and liberals to think of, who are often very militaristic. And of course, I noticed in the chats, there were quite a few mentions of the strength of the far right. And I think people were sort of thinking about, what can we learn about the power and strength of far right groups in the United States and around the world? Is there anything to learn? Just the two things that come quickly to mind is, one, the far right has put together a really strange kind of interesting coalition that has some elements related to what Suren was talking about. It puts together capitalists with white workers, with very religious Christian evangelicals. I mean, people from a very wide array of different, who are the most unlikely coalition building. So it does that, showing that that's possible. And I think for an issue like extinction, the building of unlikely coalitions is extremely important to think about, because there's nobody who's not part of the extinction constituency. Everybody is a part of that. And second, there's something about the role of emotion and as against reason. I think the left prides itself on being rational and applying reason to all situations. The right is kind of proudly and overtly irrational and speaks directly to emotions, and it gets leaders, whether they're Hitler types or Trump figures who are entertainers, perform well on a social media and environment and so forth. And I think that's very relevant for the left to think about. I mean, to think about extinction is emotional. It cannot be, in my view, solved entirely by rationality. And so I think there are lessons to be learned. I don't want this movement around extinction to be some sort of modeling of the far right, which is such a catastrophic movement in so many ways. And I don't want it to be an irrational movement, but I think the ability to reach beyond the likely coalitions, to reach deep into the public, because if we don't reach into the public where these public goods that will save us are relevant to virtually everybody, we can't win. And there's got to be some sort of, I'm not a religious person, but the issue we're talking about is a spiritual issue in a way that I think is sort of uncomfortable for the left to think about. Paul Shannon was a Jesuit at one point in his life, or studying to be a Jesuit. I'd be interested to hear Paul's thoughts about this. But I do think that, we can't lock this into just, extinction. It's one of 20 different, boxes we're going to look at. It's something that's, so deeply embedded in our humanity and our spirituality that it has to be, the left has to open up to this broader way of sort of thinking about and experiencing the world.
Well, thank you, Suren and Charlie. There's a question here about the role of labor in climate movement. Obviously, both of these would be pieces of this formation or non-formation that you're talking about. how do they fit together? Are they doomed to be at each other's throats? Obviously, that will lead to nothing. What are your thoughts on climate movement and labor?
Well, I'm going to let Suren speak more to this, but my quick thoughts are, one, I think the existence of the left is extremely impoverished in the areas we most need it. We don't have a strong left-leaning labor movement. At least the unions are kind of separated out from many of the identity politics movements that people identify as left. So I think, part of the problem we're dealing with is in the left, the structured left. Suren spoke to that earlier about the need to extend out our understanding of how we organize ourselves together. And the other, I'll let Suren speak to this, but my impression is that unions and labor people that are thinking about class questions are increasingly also thinking about, if you think about the Green New Deal, it's an agenda which is being sold as a labor jobs agenda that obviously is oriented toward climate. And it recognizes that there's still this very hard sell to sell a huge climate agenda without addressing labor, the huge crises in the economy and in labor. So I think the Green New Deal is one model of a kind of way of integrating climate with labor that should be addressed. But Suren, you probably can say more about this.
One of the things I said in a kind of abstract way was that we need multi-scalar movements operating at many different scales. Imagine that the elections go badly for the Democrats in December, in November. I know it's a difficult thing to imagine, right? But imagine it goes badly. At that point, what do we do? What kinds of openings? Who is it that we have to pressure? I think the politics within the United States would substantially shift to big states like New York State or California and a few other places where we can exert some pressure on the Democrats and the other groups that are in power. I think that in New York State and in California, you have many different environmental initiatives that actually speak to the interests of of labor and the labor movement, right? So, for example, there's a New York Build Public Renewables Act that is being proposed, that's supported by the socialist senators, but also other Democrats as well, more left-wing Democrats. And among other things, it facilitates the unionization of the renewable sector, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it is possible to craft policy that can build coalitions between labor and the environmental movement. And there are ways that we need to think about it. One of the mistakes that a lot of the renewable legislation made was a result of them trying to overcome problems, right? So a lot of renewable state-wide bills being proposed in New York State focused on how it can help build coalitions with inner city communities, right? The most excluded, most oppressed peoples, in addition to labor. But they ended up leaving out of their bill ways in which you could target poor rural communities. So the potential for a class-based alliance was undermined by the good idea, which is you need to bring in environmental justice communities, but it failed to bring in people who could otherwise become part of the far right. So I think that there are interesting ways of approaching this. A friend of mine who's doing research on the labor movement in Germany, where they have a very good environmental movement, right? A very good climate justice movement, argued that the German labor movement basically ignored the interests of the climate activists until climate activists on their own had moved public opinion so far in their direction that the labor movement had no obligation but to take it into account. In other words, I think that you can do it the nice way, which is you can talk with each other and develop legislation together and take on the capitalists together, or you could do it the hard way, which is you push, against the extinction triangle, and you on your own if necessary, and then if you find that a viable pathway, the other groups like labor would have to take your interests into account. And I think environmentalists for a long time have been forced to take the labor movement's interests into account, and they've moved in a good direction. I think parts of the formal organized labor movement, the bureaucracy, still have to move in the direction of the climate movement. So not a great answer, but I think there's stuff on the tracks already that we can get behind that bring together these movements.
Okay, well, we are starting to run short on time, so I'm going to just raise one more point here. It seems to me that as part of this process that needs to take place, there has to be a real sense among people that of what the stakes are. That this is a compelling vision, which would then infiltrate various types of social change efforts and movements, from the very local up to international. And that it would be like slavery, anti-slavery, it would be a unifying force. So that, as I understand it, you're talking about whatever level people are working at, this sense of how dangerous the situation is and what the possibilities are if we really put our mind to it, would be there motivating each piece of this at least to some degree, so that you could kind of use that as the unifying force.
I think you put our book together very well there, Paul. The nature of the issue itself, I mean, extinction is by itself so compelling that it's hard for people to think about. The problem is not convincing people that it's a compelling issue, because it's impossible not to think. It's finding ways to get people to approach something that's so drastically urgent and compelling, they don't turn away from it. Things can be very compelling and force people to psychologically turn away from things that are really important. And that's where I think we need to be fully aware of all the new forms of communication and persuasion that really define for people what are the most compelling things in their life, in their communities that arise online and offline. I do think that young people are really important in this. I think for many of them, this is their life. It's not an abstract issue. If you're 50 or 60 or 70, I know lots of people in that age range who say, yeah, I know this is a compelling issue. They're talking about climate, but that's for the next generation to figure out. But my students who are 17, 18, 19, 20 do not think that way. And it's not like they all immediately become, fueled by passionate activism, but there's a kind of opening because of the nature of the issue we're talking about, Paul. That the way you said this, that there's something about the nature of the compellingness of an issue that opens up its possibilities for awakening. And, I think with Ukraine, with all the worries about militarization, there's been a certain awakening that's occurred just from people, in desperate struggle to survive and willing to put their lives at stake, despite all the militarism and so forth. And I think that this extinction issue among young people in particular is going to have that same sense of awakening. It goes deep, deep, deep into the psyche and into the people's sense of their lives. And it connects people at many different levels. But, this is again where I think, following Suren's thing, it requires thinking in a really open, diverse, invitational way about a whole bunch of different scales and institutions and issues, because they all, Paul, what you just said, every issue in the planet and every issue that the left takes on is up against the triangle of extinction. You just can't ignore it. And so I think your idea is really captures what we're trying to say in the book. The triangle of extinction is facing us however we turn. Even when we try to turn away, we're facing it. And that becomes a foundation for trying to build a more diverse, impassioned, committed movement, particularly among the young, I think.
I'd like to take a bite of that apple.
Okay,
Do we have
go.
time?
Yes, go ahead, Suren.
Okay. I want to follow up on this point about a compelling idea. I believe that anti-extinction, the threat to human life, is a compelling idea that can unify us. How does it get made to be compelling?
Right.
Today, we look at, anti-slavery or emancipation as a very compelling idea. But if it was always so compelling, how did slavery exist in the first place? Or better still, how did the abolitionists move this compelling idea into the public domain so that it becomes common sense, so that 150 years later, we can say it is a compelling idea? Well, what did they do on a daily basis in the middle of the 1800s? One of the most important activities that involved whole congregations of people, right, was taking the stories of the enslaved people, taking them down, taking the oral stories and converting them to written form and having them dispersed to the broader public. They used every possible example of this big system of slavery to tell a local story. So to the extent that there was a runaway so-called slave, the rallying around to fight a local battle around the so-called runaway slave was the way in which they took this big national issue and made it very local. I gave you the example of their work to desegregate railroads and so on and so on. And they used every medium, like Charlie said, we should be using social media. In the 19th century, the most photographed person, the person who used this new medium of photography the most, was Frederick Douglass. He exploited this new technology to reach people, to humanize African Americans in the eyes of not only white Americans, right, but also among the enslaved themselves, so that they could see themselves as human beings. So, and this was him using the latest technology of the time. He also engaged with the scientific racists on the terrain of science. And this speaks to the fact that our movements have to be multi-sectoral. So there's practical activities associated with abolitionism that we can do on a daily basis today, right? There are just as there were constant runaway slaves going through various communities in the North, right? There are constant climate battles and examples of militarism that we can talk about and communicate with other people. So there's work to be done, and we have the inspiring examples of the abolitionists that this work can not only be done, but it can win.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that, Suren, and thank you, Charlie. We'll be looking forward to your book, Dying for Capitalism: How Big Money Fuels the Threat of Extinction, so that we can dig into this deeper and continue this discussion. And so I want to thank everyone who's on the we had a lot of people on the webinar tonight. Keep on thinking about these ideas. We have to figure this out together, because as our speakers have said, so much is at stake. And the possibility, the horror is there, but also the possibilities of creating something that we can really be proud of are also there. And we just have to keep on figuring how to put this together. So again, thanks very much, Suren and Charlie. I want to invite everyone interested in bringing together these various dimensions of environmental climate change issues with militarism to participate in our Peace and Climate Working Group of Massachusetts Peace Action. We deal with dealing with some very interesting topics right now. One book group, as well as working with climate groups, trying to put things together into a really powerful effort to really get a handle on these issues that we're trying to deal with. So thanks very much for everybody. Thanks, Cole, for running the show here tonight, even though we don't see you right now. And thanks to Mass Peace Action, of course, for putting together all these webinars. And this webinar, along with the other 150 or so that Peace Action has done, will be on the Massachusetts Peace Action YouTube page if you know people that you think might want to see it when they have the time. So good evening, everybody. Suren, Charlie, hope we'll be seeing you soon. Carry this on.
Well, thanks.